throughout the region widespread chemical warfare capability. And in Israel, a reported arsenal of some 300 nuclear weapons. Tonight, what's at stake when the Arabs and the Israelis meet in Spain?
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from New York, Barbara Walters.
As the world's diplomats assemble at the Middle East Peace Conference in Madrid, about the only thing we can be certain of is that the process will be neither quick nor easy. The fighting over the Middle East has gone on for generations. Tonight, President Bush left Washington for Madrid, calling the talks an historic opportunity to bring peace, while cautioning that the conference is only a first step. But there is an element of urgency to the talks. In a few minutes, we'll talk to an author who claims that Israel has at least 300 nuclear weapons, far more than anyone believed. If that's true, then Israel's Arab enemies are likely to speed up their attempts to get more powerful weapons, nuclear, chemical, and biological. The result? A scenario familiar to those of us who lived through the Cold War. Mutual assured destruction, where each side possesses enough weapons of mass destruction to deter the other side from launching a first strike. It would create in the Middle East a balance of terror. Here's ABC's Pentagon correspondent, Bob Zelnick.
The Gulf War crippled Iraq's military quest for weapons of mass destruction. Everything from so-called superguns to nuclear weapons. But the war triggered a new Mideast arms race. Many of the area's nations rushed to expand their military capabilities, acquiring a new taste for precision weaponry.
This is a tinderbox now of the world, if you will, in terms of the weapons that have been accumulated.
It is a tinderbox made worse by continuing tensions between Israel and many of its neighbors. Take the case of Syria. Short of funds, it was in recent years unable to buy much from its principal arms supplier, the Soviet Union. But the Gulf War brought alliance with Saudi Arabia, and that brought a fresh infusion of money. Intelligence sources say Syria is now using the money to buy more accurate and longer-range Scud-C missiles from North Korea, artillery and air defense systems from the Soviet Union, and T-72 tanks from former Soviet clients like Romania and Czechoslovakia. Their improved arsenal may give Damascus bargaining power at Madrid and prepare them for the worst in the event of renewed conflict with Israel.
In the event the Israelis conduct a breakthrough in the Golan or through the Bekaa and drive on Damascus from the southwest or the west, they could say, if you drive on Damascus, we'll be sending this towards Tel Aviv.
Israel, of course, has by far the most advanced arsenal in the Middle East. Aircraft, missiles, missile defense systems, and armor from the United States. No less important is a nuclear weapons program believed to be more than 35 years in the making. In his recent book, The Samson Option, investigative reporter Seymour Hersh claims the Israelis used their nuclear arsenal, reportedly at least 300 weapons, to threaten the Soviet Union in the event the Soviets intervened on behalf of their Arab allies.
They couldn't wait to tell the Russians, guys, we can get it by car, we can get it by boat, we can cross your borders, we can penetrate your country like nobody else can. We can be in Red Square, in essence, with a couple of nukes in a satchel.
Israel's former chief of intelligence denies the charges.
So thinking about 3.5 million Jews holding in the Soviet Union, and we threatening the Soviet Union, claiming that we are going to pour nuclear warheads on their heads, is more than nonsense. It's illogical.
Sagi says Israel would never be the first to use unconventional weapons. But he does not specifically deny Hersh's claim that when it came under Iraqi Scud missile attack during the Gulf War, Israel went on nuclear alert, just in case the Scuds had carried chemical warheads.
We were sitting here, the sitting ducks, having the Scuds on our heads. Do Israel have an answer to the Scuds? Yes.
Besides Iraq, Israel, Egypt, Iran, and Syria are all believed to have chemical warfare capabilities. But in nuclear capability, Israel reigns. No one questions that the U.S. was long aware of a major Israeli nuclear program and that it did little to discourage the efforts of its Cold War ally.
We have trade-offs to make.
We have to decide, is the friendship with the country involved or their strategic importance to us so great that we will tolerate their moving up the nuclear ladder?
Any move now to pressure Israel to abandon its nuclear program without addressing the threats to Israel would encounter trouble with supporters on Capitol Hill, where some think Israel's nuclear capability is a force for stability.
I think there is no doubt but that it has contributed to a healthy recognition on the part of the Arabs that from a military point of view, they have little hope of defeating Israel on the field of battle. And that, in turn, I think, has enhanced the prospects for a political resolution of the conflict.
Others in the area are also working on nuclear weapons. There are reports Algeria is building a research reactor, and Iran has what Western intelligence believes is its own weapons program.
The program itself looks like it's still pretty early in terms of where it is. On the other hand, we misjudged where Iraq was, and it's possible that there is some undiscovered activity in Iran that might surprise us one day.
Intelligence sources say China is providing nuclear assistance to both Algeria and Iran. Some sources believe it has offered similar help to Syria.
They apparently were willing to, in order to get international exchange money, to sell technology and have their technological nuclear teams go out and give advice in different countries for a price.
No one suggests that the Mideast tinderbox will become less dangerous overnight because of what happens during the next several days in Madrid. But there are some reasons to believe it can be kept from exploding. For one thing, relations are improving among the world's largest arms suppliers: the United States, the Soviet Union, China, Great Britain, and France. At a recent London conference, they agreed to prevent nuclear technology from proliferating and to exercise restraint in selling arms to the Middle East. Real arms control? No, but at least a start. And by improving the political climate in the area, many hope Madrid is the next step. This is Bob Zelnick for Nightline in Washington.
Joining us from our Washington bureau are Seymour Hersh, who claims in his new book, The Samson Option, that Israel has at least 300 nuclear weapons, and Jeffrey Kemp, who was a Middle East expert at the Reagan White House and now is a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Kemp's new book is The Control of the Middle East Arms Race. Mr. Hersh, let's start with you. Mr. Bush and Mr. Gorbachev are going to meet in a few hours to talk about, among other things, the arms race, arms control in their part of the country and our part of the country. But in the Middle East countries, arms control isn't even on the agenda. Should it be?
Sure, but it's not, and it never has been.
Well, is that a terrible thing that it isn't?
I guess if you're an Israeli, it isn't. I listened with interest to Congressman Solar's notion that Israel's bomb are a force of stability in the Middle East. I think that's ludicrous. I don't think you're going to get a peace in the Middle East until you resolve the question of the Israeli arsenal and the question of who has them and who doesn't. No Arab country is going to allow Israel to stand and sit with bombs looking right down the throat of them.
Mr. Kemp, do you think it should have been part of the agenda, or do you think there's enough on the agenda without adding that to it and perhaps derailing the peace talks?
Well, it is part of the agenda. If the Madrid talks are successful and they break up into bilateral and multilateral meetings, arms control will most certainly be on the agenda, but I don't think they'll get that far at Madrid. Madrid is a show for the media. There will probably be no substantive discussions at that point. Sooner or later, arms control has to be on the agenda, but it's not just to do with nuclear weapons. It's to do with the whole panoply of issues, from conventional weapons to nuclear weapons and to demilitarized zones, the works.
Well, Mr. Hersh, let's go back to the argument that we heard the beginning of the discussion about. Let us say that you're correct. Let us say that Israel does have 300 nuclear weapons and that the United States knows about this. It can be argued that they're our friend, they're our ally, and that we have nothing to worry about, and that furthermore it does somehow create a balance because Arab countries will not go after Israel as long as they know what a force they have. How do you answer that?
Well, that has been the American position for many years. Basically, we've acquiesced in the bombs. We've looked the other way.
But what's wrong with that?
Well, what's wrong with that is, for one thing, we've been urging the world to adopt nonproliferation. We've been going around insisting that other countries come into the fold and sign various international agreements to stop making nuclear weapons. And at various times, we've been totally hypocritical. And some of the nations, Pakistan, for example, has told us to go fly a kite. I mean, they know that we're looking the other way at Israel, and we have a double standard for Israel. I think if we're going to get real arms control, we're going to have to come to grips with the Israeli bombs. I'm not saying get rid of the bombs. That's impossible, but at least to acknowledge them. It wouldn't be such a bad idea for the United States to at least say something in public about the Israeli arsenal, other than to simply acquiesce in the Israeli position that we're not really talking about it.
Say what? We know about it and it's okay?
No, I think we ought to say the same thing the Soviets have been saying for many years, since the middle 80s, Shevardnadze among others. Let's start talking about resolving the enormous disparity between Israeli nuclear arms and the rest of the Arab world. We're not going to get peace. I can guarantee you no Arab country is going to agree to a final settlement without resolving the nuclear issue.
Mr. Kemp, what do you think the U.S. should do? What should be their position?
Well, the arms control agenda has to include the conventional weapons as well, because from an Israeli point of view, and one I think a lot of Americans share, the Arabs have the advantage of demography, geography, and money. And they can buy, weapons that the Israelis have to rely on the United States for. I'm all in favor of talking more about the Israeli nuclear weapon. I think there has been a lot of hypocrisy here. But quite frankly, the United States has turned a blind eye to nuclear developments in Pakistan, in India, in Britain. In fact, we've helped Britain and France with nuclear weapons. So our record on nuclear proliferation is ambivalent, period. I think right now, the most important thing we have to do is to try to persuade Mr. Shamir and the people of Israel to trade land for peace.
Well, that's true, and we all agree on that, but should we be pressuring Israel to do something about the nuclear weapons, to reduce them? Should we use it as another form of pressure?
I think this is a very inappropriate time, just when the Israelis are very nervous about the whole world ganging up on them, to try to get them to resolve their nuclear issue as well as the territorial issue. What we should be doing is working towards a situation where ultimately we can put a cap on the Israeli nuclear weapons program so that the 300 number that Cy Hirsch mentions doesn't go up to 3,000. That would be disastrous.
Do you really think you can separate, excuse me one second, Jeff, you can separate the nuclear issue from the land for peace issue? I don't know if you can.
Arabs I have talked to in private, particularly Palestinians, would much prefer the Israelis to make concessions on land, and if they're going to feel more secure about giving up land by holding on to some nuclear weapons, I think in private most Arabs will say, do so. Be our guest. We'll solve the nuclear issue later on when we've got a lot of other questions resolved, more fundamental ones that are more important to us.
Jeff, you know what they do? They try and develop their own nuclear weapons. We've seen this in Iraq. We're going to see it in other countries. What we're looking at is, without some sort of controls in this area, we're looking at a nuclear Arab world. It's inevitable. It's just a question of technology. Another 10, 15 years, it'll be much easier to obtain. I think in the long run, it's to everybody's advantage to start dealing with this question now.
It's certainly important to talk about it now, but the point is, now that Iraq has been put on wraps, our priority is to make sure Iraq does not get hold of nuclear weapons. The Egyptians are not going to build the bomb in the near term. The Saudis are not. The Iranians are a possibility, but they're a long way off. Okay. I think we have a window of opportunity now to work on the more fundamental issues of land for peace.
Before we pause, I want to clear, when you were talking a moment ago, Mr. Kemp, and you talked about land for peace, I said, well, we all agree to that. What I mean is we all hope that something will come out of this conference, but of course we don't all agree that it should be land for peace. That's part of the discussion right now in Madrid. We'll come back with more. If something should be done, and if arms in the Middle East should be controlled, how do you do that when all different countries around the world are very happy to sell arms for a little extra cash? We'll continue our discussion in a moment. Continuing our discussion on the arms race in the Middle East with Seymour Hersh and Jeffrey Kemp. Mr. Hersh, in your book, you talk about the fact that Israel was on full nuclear alert 3 times that you know of, twice during the 1973 war, and once for several weeks during the Gulf War. I presume the United States knew about this. Did they say to Israel, don't you dare? What was the attitude of this country?
Oh, the attitude of this country was, of course, we were a little bit surprised and frightened at first. We misjudged. In the beginning, when we began the war, we thought we could take out, if you remember, the Scuds in western Iraq that were threatening Israel. We found out when Saddam Hussein began firing Scuds that we had failed. And there was a panic because in the beginning, we, like the whole world, that we watched it on television, initially thought some of those Scuds may have poison gas. And I don't have to tell you that the last time somebody who was Jewish was killed by poison gas was at Auschwitz and Treblinka. And no Israel leader would stand for that. It turned out not to be poison gas, but we did see on one of our passes, and this comes from a senior American intelligence officials, one of our satellite passes, we suddenly saw their launchers aimed, I can tell you, towards downtown Baghdad, and there was no illusions about what the threat was. Israel went on alert, I think, basically during the whole war, 5 or 6 weeks.
And the United States obviously let that be.
Well, we came, let it be. There wasn't much we could do about it. We came rushing with, satchels of money and promises of help. Anything we could to assure them that we would do what we could to mop up the scuds, which we tried to do as best we could, the launches, that is. Basically, we did nothing because there was not much we could do. I'm just one thing I must add. Jeff's notion that the Arabs he talks to will happily settle for a nuclear-armed Israel. I would just say this, that you just put the context of the war in the Middle East between the Arabs and the Jews in the context of the United States and the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. Was there any time we would have settled for Soviet being nuclear-armed and us not? I think it's very patronizing to think that the Arab world would, at any time, once they get down to final negotiations a long way away, settle for a disparity in having a heavily armed nuclear Israel looking down their throat.
But that's not what I said. I said that in the first instance, it's more important for most of the Arabs to get the Israelis to withdraw from territory than to dismantle their nuclear arsenal. Of course, you're right. In the long run, no Arab state, including the Egyptians, can live with permanent asymmetries.
Okay, but let me just, in the time that we have left, we are all extremely worried that this could be the next tinderbox, a word that we have kept using throughout this program. How do you have arms control in the Middle East when you have countries, including some of the republics in the Soviet Union, who would sell arms for money? How do you begin? How do you stop it?
It's very, very difficult, and one of the problems is it's not just arms, it's technicians and scientists, engineers who are unemployed, who are going to be interested in working in Iraq or Iran if they ever get their oil pumping again and get foreign currency. There's a lot more that we could discuss if we had time. The arms race is very ominous, including the conventional munitions that we saw used during the Gulf War.
Okay, you have to give advice today to the United States government. What would you tell them, Mr. Hirsch?
I would say stop the hypocrisy. Let's talk about Israel in the same way we talk about other countries. Let's show that we're willing to be even-handed in this whole approach to defusing the arms race. I think that would help us a lot in the third world. I think they don't see us as legitimate brokers at this point.
I don't think what the third world thinks, quite frankly, matters concerning the Israeli-Arab conflict. What is important is to get a majority of Israelis to the point where they're prepared to compromise. Now, on the nuclear issue, the Labour Party will be in complete agreement with Likud. This is one issue they're united on. They are divided on the issue of land for peace. That's the most sensitive issue. That's where the focus of our policy should be.
We still haven't discussed what we do with the other countries who might be selling arms and how we stop them. We'll come back and perhaps we'll have a moment or two to see if we can give a quick answer to an enormous problem. We'll continue our discussion in a moment. In the very little time we have left, we talk about arms control between the United States and the Soviet Union. Is there any way to have worldwide arms control to stop countries from selling arms?
We can ask Mr. Bush and Mr. Gorbachev that because, of course, the United States and the Soviet Union are among the leaders in arms sales. If we were to suddenly cut back, I think, or announce some unilateral cutbacks and how many arms we're going to sell, it might set a precedent. It's very tough, but it's awfully hard for us to cast stones at other people, and we're sort of in the middle of it ourselves.
Well, part of that's already going on. The 5 key suppliers have already agreed to talk more about this subject. What we need to do is to convince those republics in the Soviet Union that if they sell arms to the Middle East, they won't get any aid from the United States or the West. And we need to convince the Chinese and the North Koreans that if they want help also, they should desist selling things like missiles to the Middle East. There's a lot that we can do with leverage. We're very powerful at the moment on this point of view. Yes, we're still selling arms to the Gulf countries, to Israel, to Turkey, and to Egypt, but these are our friends. We're going to continue selling arms. What we have to make sure is they do not get the most sophisticated weapons that we used in the Gulf War, and I don't think they will.
Thank you, Mr. Kemp, and thank you, Mr. Hirsch, for being with us. This is a discussion I'm certain we're going to have a great deal more of in the weeks and months ahead, even if it's not going to take place right now in Madrid. Thank you for being with us. We'll continue coverage all this week in the Madrid conference. I'm Barbara Walters in New York, and for all of us here at ABC News, good night to you.